Great. Thanks very much for the invitation to come here to lovely Southern California. It's getting to that time of year where New York is sort of nice for a few weeks anyway, but it's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to sort of give you a tour of scientific publishing. Now, I happen to agree with some of the things I've heard, actually a lot of what I've heard until this point. Misconduct is not the sort of massive player in terms of the failure to reproduce. I am, however, going to say that the story is a bit more complicated than a lot of people would necessarily like to think, and I'm excluding our present audience who's obviously done a lot of thinking about this. And at the very least, misconduct as a bit of human behavior is a sort of useful lens to try and understand what's really happening. Another way to think about it is, and I trained in clinical medicine, so I'll use an inappropriate clinical metaphor, and you won't know the difference, but this is sort of failure to reproduce on steroids. That is to say, all of the incentives that are leading to all of what we've heard about in terms of replicability and failure to reproduce and all of that, well, for some percentage, and I'll talk about what percentage of people that actually is sort of them on steroids. So I mentioned I'm going to give you a tour of scientific publishing. This isn't the highlights tour. It's a little bit more like the lowlights tour. If you're reading the, I don't know if the gossip pages exactly, but maybe the police blotter of science. So this is actually a post that we just put up last week. A publisher, Springer, is a pretty major publisher. They retracted 107 studies from a single journal. That's a record. You'll hear me talk about a couple different records at Retraction Watch. We think of ourselves maybe like sports journalists more than science journalists, so we like our leaderboards. You'll see that in a couple minutes. But they retracted 107 papers at once because of fake peer review. Now, I take it from some of the introductions or what have you that, most of you are probably familiar with peer review, but those of you who may not be, I'll just briefly explain, and I'm going to oversimplify here, but it's basically when a paper is sent, or a grant or anything is sent out for other peers, other people who aren't you, and that's really important here, and so remember that part, review it and say, yeah, we should publish this, or it should get, you should do this, or change this, or maybe we shouldn't publish it, you shouldn't get this grant. The idea is that it is reviewed by peers. So here's what happened in this case, and actually what has happened, this is not the very first time this has happened, actually. So let's say that I'm a researcher, and I want to get a paper published. And that's what I have to do. As we heard, you need impact, and you need to get published in high impact factor journals and all of that. So I want to make sure I get this paper published. I know that if it gets sent out to peer review, I don't know who's going to see it. Now, maybe it's a small field, maybe I sort of do, but I want to make sure that the right people see that. In fact, maybe the right person sees it. So I pick a journal that allows me to suggest peer reviewers, right? Now, ordinarily, I sort of make a joke about the fact that the person you'd want to peer review one of your papers is your mother, but my mother's actually here, so I sort of can't make that joke. And thank you, Mom, for being here. But so you send out some review. You say, I think that Simon Cole should review this paper. And as the editor, let's say I'm going to be the editor now for a second. The editor says, oh, yes, Simon, I saw him at the last, a tumor biology meeting, and he did really smart. Oh, I'd like him among my reviewers. So I press invite to Simon. And, I, as the editor, get back a review, and it's a pretty glowing review. It says I should fix some things in the paper, that the author should fix some things in the paper, but, accept it after that. But the reason why 107 papers that went through that very process, which were published but then are now retracted, is that it actually wasn't Simon who got that peer review invitation. It wasn't simon.cole@uci.edu, whatever your email address is. It was scole123@gmail.com. And can you guess who actually controlled scole123@gmail.com? Well, it wasn't Simon. It was actually the author of the paper. So 107 people either did this, some of them actually didn't know they were doing it because they were working with a sort of publication editing company, which I can answer some questions about later. I don't want to, in the interest of time, get into that detail too much. But they got to peer review their own papers. And you know how they got caught? The very first cases of this, how they got caught? All of the reviews, and this was back in 2012, all of the reviews came back within 24 hours. Okay, so now I actually know there are a lot of peer reviewers in the audience or people who've run journals because you know that nothing ever comes back in 24 hours. You can't get people to agree to peer review in 24 hours. So over time, 450 papers have been retracted now since 2012 for fake peer review. Now that's a big jump, 107 just last week. So, it wasn't quite whatever that is, 90 a year, but it's going along at a pretty good clip. So that's my beginning sort of telling you what is happening here. Now, we talk about retractions. Obviously, I run Retraction Watch. Adam Marcus and I co-founded that in 2010, so not quite 7 years ago now. And what we didn't know was that there was a big jump in retractions that had been happening over the past decade. So when we launched it in 2010, it turns out there were about 400 retractions per year. In the year 2000, there were only 40 retractions per year, 35 actually, but there was a tenfold increase, 1,000% increase from 2000 to 2010. And then these are more recent data from PubMed and Medline. These, by the way, we're talking actually in those cases only about, in this case, only about PubMed and Medline. So the real number of retractions, because that doesn't include every journal, is probably, honestly, probably closer to between 800 and 900. Now, I want to be very clear, and this sort of gets to the point that was made earlier about fraud not being sort of the root of all the problems in reproducibility. This is out of about 900,000 papers that is indexed in PubMed every year. I would argue, and I'll give you a little bit of sort of support for this, if not actual evidence, that is too small a number. So if the rate of retraction is something, whatever that number turns out to be, and the numbers I gave you are a little bit apples and oranges, but trust me for a moment and say it's 0.02% per year. That's a vanishingly small percentage of papers retracted, of course. I'll get to the reasons in a second. But then if you look at a paper that a bunch of surveys, a meta-analysis of surveys that Dan Finelli, who's now at Stanford, did in 2009, he published a study that said, this meta-analysis said 2% of researchers actually admit, when you ask them anonymously, survey them, to committing something that would be research misconduct. That doesn't mean that those are 2% of all the papers in the world. I mean, apples, oranges, grapefruits, whatever else grows here in lovely California, but something is happening. And so the question people always ask is, why are retractions on the rise? I mean, they definitely are. And they're very much outpacing the rate of growth of papers. Okay, so in that same 10-year period that I mentioned, the growth in retractions was tenfold. The growth in papers was only 44%. So it's sort of 20 times what you would expect. And I would say that until about a year ago, I would have stood here, and if anyone asked me that, I would have said, because we're better at catching them, right? And it's true. So all papers are online now, pretty much. You can, use Photoshop. Plagiarism detection software actually is responsible for a good chunk of these. You can do all those things that you couldn't do, certainly 15 years ago and arguably 10 years ago. So you're seeing an increase. It's like screening for a disease. I mean, this is just, basic sort of understanding. I will also say, though, that in fact, there does seem to be an increase in misconduct, at least in certain areas and using certain methods. So this paper, which actually I think is the one that you were citing, Ozzy was citing, which I'll get to in a second, but two of the authors of this paper, and Ellie's Bick, Ellie's actually did most of the work on this paper I'm about to describe. Ellie's went through 20,000 different papers, and she looked at all the images in these papers. This was how she spent her nights and weekends for, I think it was 4 years. Pretty amazing, actually. It's a wonderful paper. And she found that the rate of inappropriate image manipulation went from about 1% in 2000 to, by 2015, from 2% in 2000 to about 4% in 2015. Meaning that, again, that's just one kind of misconduct. It's not everything. It is a fairly common reason for retraction, which I'll get to here in a second. But that suggests that actually, whether it's the pressures, whether it's something else, the ability to do it, which is also another explanation, we are seeing an increase. But just to sort of circle back to this paper, so this paper found that 2/3 of retractions were due to misconduct. Now, the 43% is of sort of severe fraud, if you will. The 67%, which is 66%, included fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. Okay, so that's the federal definition of misconduct. And they were only able to do that because, not to toot our own horn, but in large part because of Retraction Watch. A lot of the notices did not actually say what the reasons for retraction were, and I'll get to that in a second. But one of the authors, Grant Steen, had actually done a paper where he looked at retractions and only and fewer than half of them were due to misconduct. That's because he went only by what it said in the notice, which, hey, it doesn't always include the right reason. I promised you a sort of bit of a leaderboard here. We like ours at Retraction Watch. This is our leaderboard of who's retracted the most papers. So how many of you work in labs that have published at least 183 papers? Okay, so a few of you have a chance, and we can talk later about, because we have prizes and all sorts of things for you. But no, so there are a couple things to notice about this. One is, and I will tell you later in a brief version, in the interest of time, the story of Yoshitaka Fuji and how he climbed this impressive, he got that impressive figure. Number one and two, they're actually both anesthesiologists, so I would argue that means you should trust the surgery you're about to have more, or at least in the anesthesia you're about to have more, but others might disagree. Did anyone notice anything about all 10 of these names? By the way, we go to 30 on our list, but anyone notice anything demographically about these 10 names? Thank you. So they're all men. If you go all the way to 30, there's only one woman on the list. She's way at the bottom, and she's in serious danger of being kicked off the list. So as someone who, wants to see, whether you want to call it egalitarianism, equality, I'd like, no. I mean, so, and again, it turns out that there was a study that sort of suggested that maybe men were more likely to retract for fraud, actually much more likely. And that may still hold, but actually a more recent study, actually by some of the people I've already mentioned, found that gender was not, and sex was not a determinant, but again, we're sort of the jury is still out. But the men are definitely putting up the impressive numbers. That's incontrovertible. This is another bit that actually Ferrick and Arturo, Ferrick, Fang, Arturo, Castoval, a lot of people want to know which journals retract. And again, this gets to impact in some large part because the impact factor, which obviously measures, well, it doesn't really measure impact. It's a metric that alleges to measure impact. It actually correlates quite well, not 100%. The Lancet's off doing its own thing, which is often true of the Lancet. But retraction is just rate of retraction. So as you can see, the higher the impact factor, the higher the rate of retraction. Now, what this could mean is that people are just looking at those papers more because they're in the bigger journals, and that's probably true also. But it could also mean that people are pushing the envelope to get there. Yep. So to sort of get back to this idea that a lot of retraction notices are fairly useless, I'm sure all of you can tell me exactly why this paper was retracted because, in Southern California, you're all clairvoyant. However, we couldn't tell. And it turned out that the reason this paper was retracted was because the author had been committing misconduct, had been investigated for misconduct, and it turned out also had been using a grant that was supposed to be studying cancer. He had decided that it was more important to study hair loss treatments. I can tell you that I personally feel that's a really important thing to study, but I don't actually think it's more important than cancer, especially if that's what your grant's for. I bolded the important part here, but this is just saying that, in fact, some journals have decided, hey, you know what? You guys are right. We're going to start including more information. And just briefly to tell you a little bit about what has been happening that has led to a lot of this. Some of you may know PubPeer. It's somewhat controversial to some people, not to me, but PubPeer basically, and I won't read you this quote, but go to pubpeer.com. You can leave comments on any study you want, any paper you want. You can leave them anonymously. You can also leave them on PubMed Commons using your name, and that's also fine. Now, again, there's some concerns about that, and I think those are legitimate. But what has happened, it's really in response to the fact that journals are not that interested in correcting the scientific record, or at least they don't seem to be, and they're not that interested in having discussions about papers, at least the ones we know about. Again, I'll tell you the very quick story here, and again, in the interest of time, about Yoshitaka Fuji. But I just want to, I won't tell you the whole story, but basically, a lot of people say, well, how do you get to 183 retractions? Like, what is that conversation with your dean like? Like, is it like, well, Dr. Fuji, you had 1 retraction, 2 retractions, like, just be careful, thanks, okay, off to your lab. You got 9 or 10, well, listen, you can get to 182, but 183 we're going to have to take measures, That's not actually what happened. They all happened at once. And the reason they happened at once is because someone ran, and this is happening more and more, and it's happened in psychology, actually. Yuri Simonson has been doing a lot of this work in that field. They ran an analysis, a fairly simple one, actually, statistical analysis. And again, I'm oversimplifying here, but realized that the chances that the results were real, in other words, that they had the variation, the variability that you would expect among human subjects, was essentially zero. So they couldn't be real. I mean, again, I'm oversimplifying that, but that's the journalist version. I will just briefly say that people are, although it's still incredibly rare, people are going to jail, going to prison for scientific fraud. This is a pretty dramatic case for many reasons, but Dong-Pyu Han was studying HIV vaccines in rabbits, and he's serving almost 5 years in prison now. And so it doesn't pay. But I will say, I'll just leave you with this, which is that doing the right thing does pay, okay? So what this study found, this has been replicated, so happily we can say that. When people retract for misconduct, what happens to them afterward is that they tend to have fewer citations to their work. Not just those papers, of course, but all of their work. In fact, to their whole subfield. When they retract for honest error, and the retraction notice is clear about that, they actually don't see a bump. They don't see a decline. They may even see a bump, although that part didn't really replicate, but the part that did replicate is that they don't see a decline. So if I can leave you with anything hopefully, it's that if you do the right thing, and scientists do the right thing, they won't face terrible consequences, and I just have to flash that for 10 seconds, so it's up there. Thank you.